Welcome back to the channel. Summer is supposed to be a time of joy and laughter. But what happens when the sun sets and the darkness creeps in? Join me as we delve into 3 terrifying true stories that will make you rethink your summer plans. From chilling encounters in the dead of night to eerie fairgrounds shrouded in fog, these tales will send shivers down your spine. But before we dive into the horror, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that could haunt your dreams. It was the summer of 2015, and the small town of Maplewood was buzzing with excitement as residents prepared for the annual summer fair. Families would gather in the town square sharing laughter, enjoying carnival rides, and indulging in sweet treats. However, this year would be different. This year, darkness would cast a long shadow over the festivities. At the center of the unfolding events was Sarah, a bright and spirited 17-year-old who was excitedly helping her parents organize their food stall for the fair. On the evening of July 15th, Sarah and her friends, Jake and Emily, were preparing to head to the fair after finishing their chores. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, creating a picturesque summer evening. "Are you guys ready? I can't wait for the Ferris wheel," Sarah exclaimed, her excitement contagious. "Yeah, I'm going to win you that giant stuffed bear, Sarah," Jake teased, flashing her a confident grin. As they arrived at the fairgrounds, the vibrant lights and sounds filled the air, creating a sense of joy that was almost tangible. Laughter echoed as children ran past them, clutching candy apples and cotton candy, while the smell of fried dough wafted through the air. The trio quickly got lost in the festivities, riding roller coasters and playing games, each moment more exhilarating than the last. But as the sun sank deeper into the night sky, a heavy fog began to roll in, enveloping the fairgrounds in an eerie haze. "Is it just me, or is it getting kind of creepy out here?" Emily said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's just the fog," Sarah reassured her, trying to shake off the ominous feeling settling over them. "It's summer, it's supposed to be fun." However, as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Unexplained shadows flitted through the fog, and the cheerful sounds of laughter were replaced by an unsettling silence. "I think we should head back," Emily suggested, glancing around nervously. "Oh, come on. It's just a little fog," Jake said, dismissing her concerns. "Let's go check out the haunted house." Reluctantly, Sarah and Emily agreed, hoping that the thrills of the haunted house would distract them from the growing unease they felt. They approached the entrance, a dilapidated structure adorned with cobwebs and creepy decorations. As they stepped inside, a chill ran down Sarah's spine. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. They walked through the dimly lit corridors, startled by sudden jump scares and eerie sound effects. But just as they were about to exit, Sarah noticed something strange, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her heart racing. "See what?" Jake asked, focused on the exit. "Never mind," she replied, shaking her head. "Let's just get out of here." As they stepped back into the fairgrounds, they noticed that the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The once vibrant lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. "Maybe we should really leave now," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly. Suddenly, the loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing, "Attention everyone. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we regret to inform you that the fair will be closing early tonight." Panic surged through the crowd as people began to disperse. Confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What's going on?" Sarah wondered aloud. Before they could react, they heard a commotion near the food stalls. A crowd had gathered, whispering and pointing. The trio moved closer to see what had captured everyone's attention. As they pushed through the throng, a chilling sight met their eyes. A young girl, no older than 8, was standing in the middle of the square, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She clutched a teddy bear tightly to her chest, her voice trembling as she said, "I saw him. I saw the man in the shadows." The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling through the spectators. "What man?" someone asked, voice low and cautious. "The man who took my brother," the girl cried, tears streaming down her face. "He was watching me. I saw him in the fog." Sarah's heart sank as she exchanged worried glances with Jake and Emily. "We need to find her parents," Sarah said urgently, scanning the area for any sign of the girl's family. Before they could act, a deep, guttural voice boomed from the back of the crowd. "Nobody leaves. The fog is hiding something dangerous." A tall figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the flickering lights. The crowd gasped again, instinctively stepping back as the man advanced, his face hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling. "I am here to warn you," the man replied, his voice low and ominous. "Something has awakened in the fog. It's not safe here." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. The man stepped closer, revealing a haunted look in his eyes. "There's a reason this fair hasn't been held in years. The last time it happened, several children went missing, never to be seen again." The atmosphere thickened with tension as the crowd held its breath. The little girl clung tighter to her teddy bear, trembling as she glanced around. "Do you think it's happening again?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Before the man could respond, the lights flickered once more, plunging the square into darkness for a heartbeat. When the lights returned, the man was gone, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. "What just happened?" Sarah said, her heart racing. "We need to find a way out of here," Jake urged, gripping Sarah's arm tightly. "Let's go find the car," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. They made their way through the thinning crowd, the oppressive fog thickening around them. As they reached the parking lot, they felt an unsettling chill in the air, almost as if the fog was alive and reaching for them. They fumbled for their car keys, but as Sarah searched her pockets, panic set in. "Oh no, I think I left my keys at the food stall." "Seriously?" Jake exclaimed, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'll go back and get them," Sarah said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Are you crazy? You can't go back there alone," Emily protested. "I'll be quick, just wait here," Sarah insisted, her resolve hardening. Reluctantly, Jake and Emily agreed, and Sarah turned back toward the fairgrounds, the fog swirling ominously around her as she walked. The sounds of the fair faded into an eerie silence, each step echoing in the empty space. As she approached the food stalls, she felt a sense of dread wash over her. The area was deserted, the lights dimmed to an unsettling glow. "Where are you, keys?" she muttered to herself, rifling through her bag. Just then she heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind, "Help me." Her blood ran cold. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called out, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no response, just the sound of the fog rolling in, wrapping around her like a shroud. Suddenly, she caught sight of movement in the shadows, a figure lurking just beyond the reach of the light. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a boy around her age, his clothes tattered and dirty. His eyes were wide with fear. "You need to leave. He's coming for you." "Oh?" Sarah asked, her pulse racing. "The man in the fog," he said, glancing around nervously. "He takes people, one by one." Panic surged through Sarah. "Where's my brother?" he suddenly cried, looking past her, desperation etched on his face. "Wait, what? You have a brother?" she asked, confusion mingling with fear. "He went missing last summer during the fair," the boy shouted, his voice breaking. "You have to help me find him." Before she could respond, a deep laugh echoed through the fog, chilling Sarah to the bone. "You're too late," it taunted. "He's mine now." Terror gripped Sarah as she turned to run, sprinting back toward where she had left Jake and Emily. The fog felt alive, wrapping around her legs and pulling her back, but she fought against it, adrenaline propelling her forward. "Sarah!" she heard Jake shout, his voice filled with panic. She burst into the parking lot, gasping for breath. "We need to go." "Now!" she cried, tugging at their arms. "What happened?" Emily asked, eyes wide with fear. "There's something out there. Something in the fog," Sarah panted. They ran toward their car, but as they reached it, Sarah froze in horror. "Where's the boy?" she gasped. Jake and Emily exchanged confused glances. "What boy?" Jake asked. "The boy who warned me," she exclaimed, panic surging through her. But before they could respond, the fog thickened, enveloping them completely. They could barely see each other, the darkness closing in. "Get in the car." In the summer of 1996, a group of friends from Chicago decided to head out for a weekend camping trip before the new college semester began. Rachel Miller, a 22-year-old biology major at Northwestern University, had been looking forward to the trip all summer. She was joined by her boyfriend Alex Carter, 23, an architecture student, along with their close friends Mark Stevens, 22, and Lisa Turner, 21. Their destination was Devil's Lake, a secluded, forested campground near Baraboo, Wisconsin, known for its jagged cliffs and eerie, mirror-like waters. Rachel had camped there once before with her family when she was a child, but back then, it had seemed more like an adventure. Now, as an adult, something about the place felt off. Darker, more mysterious. They left Chicago early on the morning of August 14, 1996, in Alex's beat-up Honda Civic. The drive took them through quiet back roads and long stretches of nothing but trees and empty fields. As they got closer to their destination, cell service became spotty, and the road signs fewer and farther between. It was clear that this place was truly off the beaten path. They arrived around 1 p.m., the sun high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the dense woods surrounding Devil's Lake. The heat of the summer day was oppressive, the air thick and humid. They quickly set up camp in a designated clearing near the edge of the lake, excited to relax, swim, and hike. As they set up their tents, Lisa couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. "This place is a little too quiet, don't you think?" glancing around at the thick wall of trees that bordered their campsite. Mark laughed, brushing off her concerns. "That's the whole point, Lisa. No distractions, no noise, just nature." Rachel, however, felt a similar sense of unease. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't just the absence of people. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing. The lake, normally a popular spot for campers and hikers, seemed unusually deserted for such a warm, clear summer day. That night, after a day of swimming in the lake and hiking the nearby trails, the group sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. They stayed up late, laughing and drinking, until one by one they drifted off to bed. By midnight, the fire had burned low, and the campsite was quiet, save for the occasional crackling of the dying embers. Around 2 a.m., Rachel was jolted awake by a noise outside her tent, a sharp, high-pitched scream that echoed through the still night air. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. It was a human scream, that much was clear, but it sounded distant, like it came from deep within the forest. She listened intently, her body tense with fear, but the scream didn't come again. Rachel turned to wake Alex, shaking his shoulder gently. "Alex, did you hear that?" she whispered. Alex groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "There was a scream from the woods," she said, her voice trembling. Alex sat up, now fully awake. He listened for a few moments, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. "I didn't hear anything, Rach. Maybe it was an animal or something." But Rachel wasn't convinced. The scream had sounded too human to be an animal. Just then, they heard rustling outside, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking in circles around their campsite. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded, his face tense. He grabbed a flashlight from beside his sleeping bag and unzipped the tent quietly. "Stay here," he whispered to Rachel. "No, wait," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there." But Alex had already slipped out of the tent, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam of light through the darkness. He scanned the perimeter of their campsite, but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence behind. Suddenly, Mark's voice called out from the other tent. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Lisa emerged from their tent, wide-eyed and visibly shaken. "There was something outside," she whispered. "It sounded like someone was walking around the campsite." Alex walked toward them, keeping his flashlight trained on the surrounding woods. "I don't see anything," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Maybe it was just an animal. But Rachel knew what she had heard. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't her imagination. The scream, the footsteps, it was too deliberate, too real. The group decided to stay awake for a while longer, sitting by the fire, with their nerves on edge. The hours dragged by, but nothing else happened that night. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they all returned to their tents, though none of them slept well. The next morning, August 15, 1996, dawned bright and sunny. as if the events of the previous night had never happened. But the group was uneasy. Lisa was the first to suggest cutting the trip short. "I don't feel safe here," she admitted as they gathered around the fire for breakfast. "Something about this place just feels wrong." Rachel agreed, but Mark and Alex were more skeptical. "We're probably just freaking ourselves out," Mark said. "It's a big forest. There are animals, noises. It's normal." Despite the uneasy atmosphere, they decided to stay one more night. But the second night would be far worse than the first. A few years ago, a man named Jack recounted an eerie summer trip that has stuck with him ever since. Jack and his girlfriend, Emma, were in desperate need of a break from their hectic city life. They found a listing for a remote cabin by a lake, promising solitude, peace, and gorgeous scenery. It seemed perfect. The cabin, located deep in the northern woods, was about a 3-hour drive from their home. The directions led them down narrow, winding roads that grew increasingly isolated. There were no other homes or signs of civilization in sight, and the deeper they went, the more uneasy Jack felt. He couldn't shake the sense that they were heading somewhere they weren't meant to be. When they finally arrived at the cabin, it was more rundown than the pictures had suggested. The windows were clouded with dust, and the wooden steps creaked under their feet. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, Jack and Emma tried to brush off the weird vibes. They were determined to enjoy their summer getaway. The first day went smoothly enough. They unpacked, swam in the lake, and tried to enjoy the peace and quiet. But by sunset, the atmosphere had shifted. The warm, inviting feel of the place turned cold as the sky darkened. Jack noticed something strange as he looked out over the lake. Far across the water, at the edge of the woods, a small figure was standing, motionless. It looked like a child, but there was something off about it. At first, Jack thought he was seeing things, maybe just a trick of the light. But when Emma came to join him at the window, she gasped. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Jack nodded, his heart pounding. The figure was still there, unmoving. They tried to rationalize it. It had to be a neighbor, right? Maybe a kid who wandered too far from home. But there were no other cabins nearby, and they hadn't seen a single person since arriving. Jack's unease grew, but Emma convinced him it was nothing. They locked up for the night and went to bed. The next morning, the figure was gone. Jack felt a little silly for letting his imagination get the better of him. But as the day went on, small, unsettling things started to happen. They found strange footprints by the shore, larger than a child's but too small to be an adult man's. Then there were the noises. Twigs snapping in the woods, the sound of rustling leaves as if someone, or something, was watching them from just beyond the tree line. By the third night, the tension was unbearable. Jack and Emma decided to leave early the next morning, cutting their trip short. But that night, something happened that would haunt them forever. They were awoken by a loud banging on the cabin door. Jack leaped out of bed, adrenaline surging through him. Emma was frozen, staring at the door in terror. It was 3 a.m., pitch black outside, and there was no reason anyone should be there. Jack grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. The banging continued, louder now, more frantic. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response, just the relentless pounding. With shaking hands, he opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight out into the night. But there was no one there. The banging had stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Jack stepped outside, shining the light in every direction. The beam caught movement. Someone was running into the woods, too fast for Jack to catch a glimpse of their face. He slammed the door shut and locked it. Emma was already packing their bags, her hands trembling. They couldn't stay another minute. By sunrise, they were gone, racing down the empty roads back to civilization. Later, Jack found out that the cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a family had lived there, a couple with a young daughter. One summer, their daughter had gone missing near the lake, never to be seen again. Locals believed her spirit still wandered the area, looking for something, or someone. Archer Avenue, just outside of Chicago, is known to many locals as a road to avoid late at night. The road, winding through dense woods and a nearby cemetery, has been the setting for countless reports of strange sightings, eerie sounds, and terrifying encounters. But one story, in particular, stands out as one of the most chilling. In 2016, a young couple, Brian and Jess, were driving home late after attending a family event in the city. The night was crisp and clear, with only the occasional car passing them as they made their way down Archer Avenue. Brian was at the wheel, and Jess was quietly scrolling through her phone, half listening to the low hum of the radio. As they approached a particularly dark stretch of the road, Jess looked up, feeling a sudden sense of unease. The trees lining the road seemed to close in, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes under the moonlight. She couldn't explain it, but something about the road ahead felt wrong. "Slow down," she told Brian, her voice shaky. Brian glanced over at her, confused. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Jess replied. I feel like something's out there." Have you ever had that sudden feeling of dread while driving at night? That feeling where your instincts tell you something's wrong, but you can't quite explain why? What do you do? Keep driving or stop to investigate? Brian chuckled nervously, but eased off the gas, slowing the car. As they rounded a bend in the road, their headlights illuminated something that made Jess gasp. There, standing at the edge of the road, was a woman. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned white dress, the fabric flowing in the slight breeze. She wasn't walking, just standing there, staring into the woods. Brian slowed the car even more, squinting through the windshield. "What is she doing out here?" he muttered. Jess couldn't take her eyes off the woman. Something about her was deeply unsettling. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes seemed hollow. Before Brian could say anything more, the woman turned and began to walk toward the car, her movements slow and deliberate. Jess panicked. "Brian, drive now." But as Brian pressed the gas pedal, the car sputtered and stalled. His face went pale as he turned the key again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "This can't be happening," he muttered, sweat forming on his brow. The woman was getting closer. Jess grabbed Brian's arm, her voice rising in fear. "Brian, she's coming. Go, go, go." Brian frantically kept turning the key, and after what felt like an eternity, the car roared to life. Without hesitating, Brian slammed his foot on the gas, speeding down Archer Avenue. As they drove away, Jess glanced back through the rear window. The woman was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign she had ever been there. Just the empty road and the swaying trees. Jess's heart was racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered. For the rest of the drive, neither of them spoke. The fear was palpable in the car, the tension so thick it was suffocating. When they finally got home, they sat in the driveway for a long time, trying to process what they had seen. A few days later, Jess couldn't stop thinking about the woman. She did some research on Archer Avenue and discovered something that sent a chill down her spine. The road was notorious for ghost sightings, particularly of a woman known as Resurrection Mary, a young woman who had died in a car accident in the 1930s and was buried in Resurrection Cemetery, not far from where Jess and Brian had seen the figure. According to the legend, Resurrection, Mary was often seen hitchhiking along the road, only to vanish when drivers stopped to offer her a ride. Some claim she appeared in the middle of the road, forcing cars to stop, while others reported seeing her walking through the cemetery at night. Jess's blood ran cold as she read the stories. The woman they had seen matched the descriptions exactly. Pale skin, a white dress, and hollow eyes. There was no doubt in her mind. They had seen the ghost of Resurrection Mary. For weeks after the encounter, both Jess and Brian were plagued by nightmares. In every dream, the woman appeared, her hollow eyes staring right through them. They avoided Archer Avenue completely, refusing to drive anywhere near it at night. But one night, several months later, they found themselves on Archer Avenue again. This time, it was unavoidable. A detour on the highway led them straight onto the road they had sworn never to drive again. The moment they realized where they were, Jess's heart started pounding. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of their engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They drove in silence, both of them scanning the road ahead for any sign of the woman. But this time, the road was empty. As they passed the cemetery, Jess glanced out the window. There, just beyond the gate, she saw a figure, a woman, standing silently among the graves, watching as they drove by. Jess didn't say a word. She didn't have to. They both knew exactly who it was. Have you ever heard of Archer Avenue or Resurrection Mary? Many locals swear by their experiences, but what about you? Would you dare drive down that haunted road at night? Share your thoughts or any personal stories in the comments below. It was a cold October night, and Mark had just left his friend's house after a long day of catching up. It was almost midnight, and the moon hung low in the sky as he got into his car and started his drive home along Route 16. The highway was notoriously desolate at night, stretching for miles through dense forests, with barely any other cars in sight. Mark didn't mind the solitude. He enjoyed the quiet, the soft hum of his engine, and the rhythmic bounce of the road beneath his tires. But that night, something felt off. As Mark passed a particularly dark stretch of road, his headlights flickered. It was brief, just a second or two, but enough to make him uneasy. He brushed it off, blaming it on a minor electrical glitch. But a few miles further down the road, it happened again. This time the lights flickered longer, as if the darkness was creeping in closer, almost alive. Mark gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. That's when he noticed the car behind him. It was a beat-up old sedan that had suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror, its headlights dim and flickering in sync with his own. Mark hadn't seen the car when he first started driving, but now it was there, tailing him closely. The driver didn't honk, didn't flash their lights, just stayed right on his bumper, almost too close for comfort. Mark's first instinct was to speed up, hoping to shake the car, but as soon as he accelerated, so did the sedan. It matched his speed perfectly, never falling behind. He glanced back again, trying to get a better look at the driver, but the windshield was completely dark, as though something or someone was obscuring it from the inside. A feeling of dread washed over him. Mark thought about pulling over, letting the car pass, but the idea of stopping on the empty highway with no other cars around didn't feel safe. So he kept driving, his pulse quickening with every mile. As the sedan continued to tailgate him, Mark's anxiety grew. He reached for his phone to call someone, anyone, but when he unlocked the screen, there was no service. Route 16 was known for its dead zones, but in that moment, it felt like a trap. The car behind him suddenly swerved to the left as if to pass him, but instead of speeding ahead, it drifted into the opposite lane and matched his speed again, this time riding parallel to him. Mark looked to his left, expecting to see the driver, but the windows of the sedan were pitch black, almost as if they'd been painted over. No face, no shadow, nothing. Just blackness. Mark's heart was pounding now. He pressed down on the gas pedal, determined to outrun the strange car. But no matter how fast he went, it stayed beside him. That's when it happened. In the blink of an eye, the car vanished. One moment it was there, its engine humming alongside his, and the next, it was gone. No screeching tires, no taillights fading into the distance, just gone. Mark slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. He looked around frantically, expecting to see the sedan reappear, but there was nothing. Only the eerie silence of the night and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. His headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but no car, no driver, no signs of life. Shaken, Mark drove home, unable to shake the feeling that something unnatural had followed him that night. Weeks later, Mark mentioned the experience to a local mechanic while getting his car checked for the flickering lights. The mechanic gave him a grim look and asked, "Route 16? You're lucky you made it home." Mark was confused, so the mechanic explained. Years ago, a man driving an old sedan had died in a head-on collision along Route 16. Locals had reported seeing a ghostly car following them late at night, always disappearing without a trace. No one knew why it appeared, but those who encountered it never forgot. Mark realized then, he hadn't been alone on that road after all. It was the summer of 2003 when Emma had her chilling encounter. She was driving back home from her friend's wedding, a long drive that took her through several small towns and winding rural roads. County Road 44 was one of those roads, narrow, poorly lit, and surrounded by thick woods on both sides. Despite the isolation, Emma found the drive peaceful, with only the sounds of the wind outside and the soft hum of her car's engine. But that night, something happened that Emma still can't explain to this day. As she drove further down the lonely stretch of road, she saw something ahead, just barely illuminated by her headlights. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or coyote, but as she got closer, she realized it was a person. A man was standing by the side of the road, dressed in a tattered jacket, his thumb out, clearly hitchhiking. Emma's first instinct was to drive past him. After all, it was late at night, and she was alone. But something about the man seemed off. He didn't look like your typical hitchhiker. There was a strange stillness to him, like he was waiting, watching. Have you ever been driving alone at night when you spot something or someone that just doesn't feel right? Do you stop? Or do you keep driving and ignore that uneasy feeling? Emma slowed down as she approached against her better judgment. Maybe he needed help, she reasoned. But as she got closer, she noticed something strange. His eyes. They seemed hollow, almost too dark for the dim light around him. Her gut screamed at her to keep driving, but before she could make a decision, the man stepped out onto the road, directly into her path. Heart racing, Emma swerved, narrowly avoiding him. As her car came to a stop on the side of the road, she glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the man standing there, maybe yelling or gesturing angrily. But he was gone. The road behind her was completely empty. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the area, her headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. There was no sign of him. He had vanished. Emma sat in her car for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her after a long day? But as she reached for her phone, her hands trembling, she realized she had no signal. County Road 44 was notorious for its dead zones, but in that moment, it felt like the road itself was trapping her. With no other option, Emma continued driving, this time faster than before, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the image of the man's hollow eyes or the way he had disappeared so suddenly. When she finally reached home, she rushed inside, locking the doors behind her. But the story doesn't end there. A few days later, Emma told her father what had happened. He grew quiet, his expression serious. Then he told her about a local legend, one that had been whispered about for years. According to the tale, decades earlier, a man had been hit by a car while hitchhiking along County Road 44 late at night. He had died instantly, but some say his restless spirit never left. Locals claimed that every few years, drivers would encounter a hitchhiker who would vanish without a trace, just like Emma's encounter. The police had looked into the reports over the years, but found nothing. To them, it was just another ghost story. But for those who had seen him, the hitchhiker was very real and very terrifying. Emma never drove County Road 44 alone at night again. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she ever did, she might not be as lucky the next time. Have you ever felt that chill in the pit of your stomach while driving down a dark road, seeing something or someone you couldn't explain? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this. As we reach the end of our journey through these terrifying true night drive horror stories, it's clear that the darkness can hide more than we ever imagine. Whether it's the chilling encounter with the hitchhiker on County Road 44 or the ghostly figure of Resurrection Mary haunting Archer Avenue, these tales remind us to stay vigilant and be wary of what lurks in the shadows during those late-night drives. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something strange while driving at night? Perhaps you've seen a figure in the rearview mirror or felt an unsettling presence that left you questioning your sanity. Share your spine-tingling stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed these eerie tales and want to hear more true stories that will keep you up at night, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell.
Pine Ridge was the kind of place you could drive through and miss entirely if you blinked. A single stretch of road with a gas station, a diner, and a few shops that closed by 6 p.m. It was quaint, with charming old homes and friendly faces where everyone knew each other. But if you looked closely, beneath the surface of politeness and routine, there was something unsettling about the town. Something no one talked about. It all started with that streetlight, the one on the corner of Elm and Maple, flickering intermittently. At first, it was just an annoyance, especially for the Johnson family, who lived in the house closest to it. Mr. Johnson had called the town's utility company several times, but no one ever seemed to come out to fix it. The light would flicker late into the night, casting strange shadows across the road. One autumn evening, young Emily Johnson was walking home from a friend's house. It was a 5-minute walk, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. As she approached that same corner, the streetlight above her started flickering again. She glanced up, annoyed, but continued on her way. But just as she crossed under the light, it went out entirely, plunging the street into darkness. Emily froze for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Then, from the shadows, she heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but chilling enough to stop her in her tracks. "Come closer." She whipped around, eyes wide, scanning the street. But there was no one there. The houses on the street stood silent and still, their windows dark. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, and hurried the rest of the way home. Emily never made it. Her parents searched for her that night, calling her cell phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. The next morning, the police were involved, and the entire town of Pine Ridge was on edge. Everyone participated in the search, combing through the woods, knocking on doors. But there was no sign of Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Then came the whispers. Over the next few weeks, more and more people began hearing the voice. Always near the flickering streetlight, and always at night. "Come closer," it would say, in that same eerie, beckoning tone. And soon, another person vanished. This time it was an older man, Mr. Granger, who was known for his evening walks around the neighborhood. He was last seen passing by the same corner where Emily disappeared. As more people went missing, fear gripped the town. No one walked alone at night anymore. The once busy streets were now deserted after dark, and the town's few businesses shut down earlier and earlier. But the flickering light remained, as did the whispers. Sheriff Daniels, a no-nonsense man who had lived in Pine Ridge his whole life, was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. He organized a late-night patrol, planning to stake out the streetlight and see if he could catch whatever was lurking there. But as the night wore on, nothing happened. The streetlight flickered, casting its strange, erratic glow, but no one came. No whispers, no shadows, nothing. That is, until the sheriff was left alone. His deputy had gone to get coffee, and Sheriff Daniels found himself standing under the streetlight, staring down the empty road. And then he heard it. "Come closer." The sheriff's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, hand on his holster, but saw nothing. The street was as empty as it had been all night, but the voice continued, clearer now. "Come closer, Sheriff." This time, he felt it, an icy breath on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, and standing in the shadows was a figure just barely visible in the dim light. Its face was pale, eyes wide and sunken, and its lips twisted into a grotesque smile. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. Before he could react, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. The flickering light above them seemed to pulse with her movement, casting eerie shadows that danced across her face. And then, she was gone. Just like that, the street was empty once more. The sheriff never spoke of what he saw that night. The next morning, he resigned, packed up his family, and left Pine Ridge for good. Over time, the town began to wither. More people moved away, the shops closed, and soon Pine Ridge became little more than a ghost town. The streetlight still flickers at the corner of Elm and Maple, and on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whisper. Red River was a small, unassuming town tucked away between rolling hills and dense forests. The kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, and the biggest event of the year was the annual county fair. It was a quiet community where nothing truly bad ever happened, or so they thought. Sarah Jennings had been teaching at Red River High for nearly 20 years. She was a fixture in the community. Everybody knew her, and most had been taught by her at some point. She lived alone in a modest house at the end of Pine Street and was known for her friendly smile, her gardening skills, and her dedication to her students. But in the fall of 2013, Sarah didn't show up for work. Her colleagues thought it was unusual, but not alarming. Maybe she had caught the flu. When a second day passed without her appearing or calling in sick, people began to worry. By the third day, the school principal called the police, who went to her home to check on her. The front door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. Her car was parked in the driveway, her purse was inside, and nothing appeared to be disturbed. It was as though Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. The search for Sarah Jennings lasted weeks. Volunteers combed through the nearby forests, knocking on every door in the town, but there was no trace of her. The town was left in a state of unease. How could someone so well-known and well-liked just disappear? Whispers began circulating, and conspiracy theories popped up. But no one had any solid answers. Until they did. About a month after Sarah disappeared, strange things started happening in Red River. People began noticing lights flickering in her house at odd hours, even though it had been locked and vacant since the search. Some of the neighbors reported seeing shadows moving inside late at night. At first, people dismissed it as their imagination. After all, Sarah's disappearance had the whole town on edge. But then, strange objects started appearing around town, items that had belonged to Sarah. Her gardening gloves were found draped over the fence at the edge of town. Her favorite blue scarf was discovered hanging from a tree near the high school, and most chilling of all, her reading glasses were left neatly on the doorstep of her neighbor's house. The sheriff's department ramped up its investigation, believing that someone in the town was playing a cruel prank or trying to terrorize the community. The town was on lockdown. No one went anywhere alone, and curfews were implemented. Then came the night of the 25th of October. That night, the sheriff received a call from the school janitor. He had been working late, cleaning up after a high school football game, when he heard footsteps coming from one of the classrooms. Thinking it was a student who had stayed behind, he went to check it out. But what he saw chilled him to the bone. Through the small glass window of the classroom door, he saw Sarah Jennings, sitting at her desk as if nothing had happened. She was dressed in the same clothes she'd worn on the day she went missing, and she was grading papers like she always had. The janitor couldn't believe his eyes. He stood frozen in place for what felt like minutes, watching her go about her routine. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and speak to her. But as soon as he did, the room was empty. There was no trace of Sarah. The janitor, now pale and shaking, ran straight to the sheriff's office, convinced that Sarah's ghost was haunting the school. The sheriff, skeptical but spooked by the town's recent events, decided to check the school out himself. What he found would forever change the way he viewed the case. In Sarah's old classroom, on the desk where she'd always sat, was a fresh stack of graded papers, marked with her unmistakable handwriting. No one could explain it. The room had been locked up since her disappearance, and the only set of keys belonged to the janitor, who swore he hadn't touched anything. But the strangest part came when the sheriff examined the papers more closely. They weren't student assignments. They were Sarah's journal entries. She had written them in the days leading up to her disappearance, and what they contained was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Sarah had begun to suspect that someone was watching her. She mentioned strange occurrences at her house, footsteps outside her windows at night, items moving around without explanation, and an overwhelming feeling of being followed. In her final entry, written the night before she disappeared, she wrote only 2 chilling words: "He's here." The discovery of the journal entries led to a renewed investigation, but no matter how hard the police searched, they couldn't find any clues about who he was. The town grew quieter, more paranoid. People stopped going out after dark altogether. The case remains unsolved to this day. Sarah Jennings was never found, and her mysterious appearances at the school stopped just as suddenly as they started. Some believe that whatever haunted her in her final days took her somewhere beyond our understanding. Others think she's still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes on cold, windy nights, students at Red River High claim they can hear the faint sound of chalk scraping across the board in Sarah's old classroom. The janitor never returned to the school, and many families have since moved away, but the legend of Sarah Jennings still haunts Red River. Silent Creek was a town you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, tucked away deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where generations of families lived and died without ever leaving its borders. The town had a dark past, but like most small towns, its residents didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. Everyone knew to stay away from certain places once the sun went down. The most infamous of these places was the old house on the edge of town, right where Silent Creek ran through the woods. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, though rumors swirled about why no one ever stayed there for long. Some said the place was cursed. Others whispered about strange sounds and figures that had been seen near the property, but no one could prove any of it. Until the summer of 2017, when Jack and Olivia Harper moved in. The couple had been looking for a fresh start after a rough year. Jack had lost his job, and Olivia's mother had passed away, leaving them feeling suffocated by the city. So when they found the old house listed online for a fraction of what they were expecting to pay, they jumped at the chance. The listing called it a fixer-upper, but they didn't care. It was perfect, quiet, secluded, and just what they needed. Their first few days in Silent Creek were peaceful. The townspeople were polite, if a bit distant, and the couple spent their time cleaning up the house, preparing to make it their own. Jack spent hours clearing out the overgrown yard, while Olivia focused on repainting and making the place feel like home. But it wasn't long before strange things started happening. It began with the sounds. At first, Olivia thought it was just the wind rustling through the old trees outside. The house was creaky, and it was easy to chalk up the noises to age. But soon, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps in the hallway at night, soft whispers just beyond the walls. Jack dismissed it, telling her it was just her imagination, that old houses make noises. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. One night, as they were lying in bed, Olivia heard it again, those same footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs toward their bedroom. Her heart raced, and she shook Jack awake, insisting he listen. But just as he opened his eyes, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent. "I'm telling you, Jack, there's someone here," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Jack's frustrated, but he got up and checked the house anyway. Every room was empty. Every window and door locked. A few days later, while cleaning the basement, Jack found something strange. A large, heavy chest buried beneath a pile of debris. It was old, its wooden surface worn and cracked, and there were strange symbols carved into it that he didn't recognize. Curious, he dragged it out into the daylight and called Olivia over. Together, they pried it open. Inside, they found a collection of old, faded photographs. The pictures were all of the same house, their house, spanning decades. Some were dated as far back as the 1920s. But what caught their attention was that in every single photo, there was something off. A figure stood in the background, just barely visible, sometimes in a window, other times in the yard. Always there, watching. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow or a smudge on the film. But the more they looked, the clearer it became. Someone had been watching this house for nearly a century. That night, Olivia woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the corner of their bedroom. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she slowly turned her head. And there, standing in the corner, was a figure. A tall, shadowy shape, darker than the room itself. Its face was obscured, but she could feel it watching her, its presence heavy and oppressive. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She could only watch as it slowly took a step toward her. The figure vanished the moment Jack stirred beside her. Olivia broke down, sobbing to explain what she'd seen. Jack, unnerved but still trying to be rational, promised they would leave the house the next day. But they never got the chance. That night, as they packed a few essentials, the house came alive. The whispers were no longer subtle. They were everywhere, echoing through the walls from the basement to the attic. Doors slammed shut on their own, and windows rattled as if something was trying to get in or trying to keep them from leaving. Then, there were the shadows. They moved like living things, creeping along the walls, growing larger and darker by the second. Jack and Olivia ran, trying to escape, but every door they reached slammed shut in their faces. The figures were closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Stay with us," the voices hissed. "You're home now." In a last desperate attempt, Jack grabbed Olivia's hand and pulled her toward the front door. But as they reached it, something unseen yanked Jack backward, pulling him into the darkness. Olivia screamed, but before she could help him, the shadows closed in, and Jack was gone, swallowed whole by the darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found Olivia wandering barefoot in the woods, her clothes torn and her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten there or what had happened after the shadows took Jack. All she could say, over and over again, was, "The house, it took him." Jack Harper was never found. The old house on Silent Creek stands empty once more, its windows dark and lifeless. Locals say that if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the whispers calling from inside. No one goes near it anymore, because in Silent Creek, they know the truth. Once the shadows take you, they never let you go. Raven Hill was a picturesque, sleepy town nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. With its quaint streets, vintage shops, and old-fashioned lampposts, it looked like something out of a postcard. For generations, life in Raven Hill had been peaceful and predictable. But in the winter of 2015, something changed. It started with Greg Meadows, the town's butcher. He was a tough, no-nonsense man known for his early morning routine of opening the shop before dawn. But one cold January night, Greg's wife Marla woke up to find him standing at the window, staring blankly out into the night. His eyes were wide open, but his expression was distant, completely empty. "Greg?" Marla whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. Then, slowly, he turned and walked out of the room, his movements stiff and unnatural. Marla followed him downstairs, calling his name, but he never acknowledged her. Instead, Greg walked right out of their front door, barefoot into the snow-covered street. Panicking, Marla grabbed her coat and ran after him, but Greg was gone, vanished into the night. The police searched for him, but they wouldn't find Greg until the following morning. He was discovered miles away, deep in the woods, standing by the edge of Raven Hill Lake, staring down into the frozen water. His feet were frostbitten, and his skin was pale and cold, but he was still alive. When they questioned him, Greg had no memory of how he had gotten there. He swore he had gone to bed as usual and had no recollection of sleepwalking. Everyone assumed it was a one-off event. Stress, fatigue, maybe even an illness. But within days, other people in Raven Hill began to experience the same unsettling phenomenon. First, it was a teenage boy, found standing in the middle of the road in his pajamas, his eyes wide but unseeing, as cars swerved to avoid him. Then it was an elderly woman, found wandering through her backyard in the freezing cold, mumbling incoherently. And soon, more and more townspeople began to exhibit the same behavior, walking in their sleep, eyes wide open, but minds completely elsewhere. At first, the sleepwalking seemed harmless, if a little strange, but then it escalated. One night, Sarah Dempsey, a single mother of two, woke up to find her young son, Timmy, standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with those same wide, unblinking eyes. His face was pale and his body was stiff, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Timmy?" she whispered, her voice trembling, but Timmy didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the window, his small hands reaching for the latch. "Timmy, no!" Sarah screamed, rushing out of bed to stop him. She grabbed him just as he managed to open the window, the freezing wind rushing in. But Timmy fought her, his strength unnatural for a boy his size. His eyes were open, but there was no recognition, no life in them. It was as though he was being controlled by something else, something far darker. Sarah managed to pull him away from the window and wake him up. Timmy had no memory of what had happened, just like Greg and the others. But now, there was no denying that something was very wrong in Raven Hill. That same night, 4 other families experienced similar terrors. Sleepwalkers across town were drawn to windows, doors, and in some cases, the river that ran through the outskirts of Raven Hill. It was as if something was calling them, pulling them toward the darkness. As the sleepwalking incidents grew more frequent and more dangerous, the town descended into panic. Families took turns staying awake at night, watching over their loved ones, afraid of what they might do in their sleep. The local doctor was at a loss. There was no medical explanation for the sudden epidemic of sleepwalking. It was like the entire town had fallen under a spell. Then came the night of the full moon. By then, almost everyone in Raven Hill had experienced sleepwalking or knew someone who had. People had started barricading themselves in their homes, trying to keep whatever was happening at bay. But on that night, nothing could stop what was coming. It began around midnight. One by one, people all over town began to rise from their beds. Children, adults, the elderly, eyes wide open but unseeing. They moved silently, mechanically out of their homes and into the streets. Entire families wandered out into the cold night, barefoot and dressed in their night clothes, moving in unison like sleepwalking zombies. They all headed in the same direction, Raven Hill Cemetery. Sarah Dempsey, one of the few still awake, watched in horror from her window as her neighbors shuffled down the street, their faces blank and their bodies moving with a purpose she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched them disappear into the fog that blanketed the cemetery. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her coat and flashlight, Sarah ran outside, determined to find out what was happening. She followed the trail of sleepwalkers, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, until she reached the cemetery. There, in the center of the graveyard, she saw them, hundreds of people, standing in a circle around an ancient, weathered grave. The stone was so old the name had long since faded. But Sarah could see something strange. A dark, shadowy figure standing in the middle of the circle. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. The sleepwalkers stood completely still, their eyes fixed on the figure as if waiting for a command. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and Sarah felt her stomach turn. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice wouldn't come. The figure's glowing eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. Suddenly, the figure raised one bony arm, pointing directly at her. And just like that, the sleepwalkers began to move again, this time, toward her. Sarah turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as the entire town, under the figure's control, chased after her. She could hear their footsteps behind her, relentless, unfeeling. She made it back to her house and slammed the door, locking it behind her. But as she looked out the window, she saw them. Hundreds of blank faces, pressing against the glass, eyes wide and staring. The next morning, the sleepwalkers had returned to their homes, with no memory of what had happened. But Sarah would never forget. The town of Raven Hill still stands, but the sleepwalking hasn't stopped. Every night, more and more people are drawn to the cemetery, their minds lost to whatever dark force controls them. And as for the figure in the graveyard, no one knows what it is, or what it wants. But in Raven Hill, no one sleeps peacefully anymore. Black Hollow was a town where nothing much happened, at least nothing that anyone talked about. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace, quiet, and distance from the chaos of the outside world. Surrounded by dense woods and far from any major roads, it was easy to forget Black Hollow even existed. But in the spring of 2008, something happened that would change Black Hollow forever. The town council decided to restore an old well that had been sealed for over 70 years. The well, located in the center of the town square, had once been a symbol of prosperity for the community. Generations had drawn water from it, but in the 1930s, it was suddenly boarded up and forgotten. No one alive knew why, but there were whispers that something dark had happened back then, something the town preferred to forget. The council, however, saw the well as an opportunity for historical preservation. They planned to make it a centerpiece of a new park they were developing to attract tourists. The locals were uneasy, especially the older residents who remembered the vague warnings from their grandparents about leaving the well sealed. But progress moved forward, and soon, construction crews were tearing down the boards that had covered the well for decades. The well was deeper than anyone expected, so deep that even with modern equipment, they couldn't see the bottom. As they dug, strange things began to happen. Workers reported hearing strange, echoing noises from within the well, as if something was moving down below. Others claimed they felt an unnatural chill every time they got close, even on the warmest days. Then, one of the workers, a man named Doug, went missing. It happened in the middle of the day. Doug had been working near the well when, without warning, he disappeared. One minute he was there, talking to his coworkers, and the next, he was gone. They found his tools lying on the ground near the well, but there was no sign of Doug. His disappearance rattled the town, but despite a thorough search, Doug was never found. The project was temporarily halted, but after a few weeks, the council insisted it resumes. They couldn't afford delays. The well restoration continued. And soon, the well was fully uncovered, its stone walls gleaming in the sunlight for the first time in nearly a century. That's when the nightmares began. The first to experience them were the workers who had been closest to the well. Each night, they dreamed of being trapped underground, surrounded by cold, wet stone. In their dreams, they could hear voices, whispering, calling their names, begging to be let out. Some of the workers started to lose sleep, their eyes sunken and haunted. But the dreams weren't just dreams. One by one, the workers who had been involved in the well project began to disappear. It always happened at night. They'd go to bed as usual, but by morning their homes were empty, their beds cold. No one ever heard a thing. Panic began to spread through Black Hollow. Families started leaving, afraid that whatever had been sealed away in the well had been unleashed. The townspeople demanded the well be closed up again, but the council refused, insisting that the disappearances were unrelated. That's when Sarah Jennings, a local historian, came forward with something she had found while researching the town's archives. Buried deep in the town's records, she discovered an old journal belonging to a man named Robert Hale, one of Black Hollow's founders. In the journal, Hale described the construction of the well in the late 1800s. But the journal also mentioned something disturbing, something no one had known about. According to Hale, the well was built on top of a natural sinkhole, a massive underground cavern that stretched for miles beneath the town. During construction, the workers uncovered something deep within the cavern, something they described as ancient and evil. Hale wrote of strange symbols carved into the stone walls and bones that were far older than anything human. The workers who had uncovered the cavern began to experience strange symptoms, sickness, hallucinations, and eventually madness. Several of them disappeared, never to be seen again. Fearing for the town's safety, Hale and the remaining townspeople decided to seal the well and bury the entire incident. They hoped that by boarding up the well, they could contain whatever was lurking beneath. But now, over a century later, the well had been reopened, and whatever had been sealed away was free once again. As Sarah shared her findings with the town, the situation grew even more dire. More people disappeared, and those who stayed behind began to see things. Shadowy figures moving in the streets at night, strange lights glowing from within the well. Some claimed to hear voices, like the ones from the workers' nightmares, calling them to the well. One night, Sarah herself was drawn to the well. She had been doing more research, trying to find a way to stop whatever was happening, when she heard it, a low, eerie hum, echoing from the well. The sound was hypnotic, pulling her toward it, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away. When she reached the well, she saw it, something moving deep within the darkness, just beyond the reach of her flashlight. It was massive, writhing, its form shifting and pulsing like it was alive. And then the whispers came, louder this time, more insistent. They weren't asking to be let out anymore. They were demanding. Sarah turned to run, but it was too late. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she fell, tumbling into the well. As she fell, she could hear the voices growing louder surrounding her, filling her mind with dark, ancient secrets. The next morning, Sarah's body was found at the bottom of the well. But the look on her face, the twisted, terrified expression frozen in her final moments, told the townspeople everything they needed to know. Whatever was in that well wasn't done yet. The town of Black Hollow is abandoned now. The well has been sealed once again, but no one dares go near it. The few who remain speak of the strange things that still happen at night, the whispers in the wind, the flickering lights in the distance. Because whatever was sealed away in the well all those years ago, it's still there, waiting. As the tales of small towns and their terrifying secrets come to an end, one thing remains clear. Sometimes it's the quietest places that hide the darkest horrors. These seemingly peaceful towns, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of big cities, have their own chilling pasts, filled with things we may never fully understand. And as these stories have shown, no place is ever truly safe. So the next time you find yourself in a small town, whether visiting or passing through, pay attention to the whispers, the rumors, and the places that the locals avoid. Because behind every smiling face and every charming street, there could be something lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching, and remember, these stories are true.
Nurse Emily Carter had worked at St. James Hospital for nearly a decade. The night shift had become her second home, a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of the day. But on the night of November 15th, 2016, the peace she cherished turned into a nightmare. It was around 2 a.m. when Emily first noticed something strange. Walking down the long, dimly lit hallway of the hospital's older wing, she heard a faint, shuffling sound behind her. She stopped and turned, but there was nothing, just the flickering lights and the distant hum of hospital machines. She shrugged it off as nerves or perhaps the janitor finishing up his rounds. The shift had been uneventful so far. A few patients came in with minor injuries, but the emergency room was unusually slow. Emily was used to the eerie stillness of the night, but something about that particular night felt different. There was an unnerving tension in the air. Around 3 a.m., Emily was at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts when she saw a shadow move out of the corner of her eye. It wasn't the usual blur of motion from a coworker. This shadow was long, tall, and seemed to glide across the floor. She snapped her head toward the direction, but again, nothing. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that, according to the staff schedule, she was the only nurse on duty in this section of the hospital. Just then, the phone at her desk rang. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. On the other end was a frazzled voice, an elderly patient from room 202. "Nurse, there's someone in my room," the woman whispered, clearly terrified. Emily rushed down the hallway, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor as she reached the door of room 202. She paused outside, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she opened the door. The patient, Mrs. Louise Harper, was sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "He was here? A man? Standing in the corner," she stammered, pointing to the far side of the room. Emily's blood ran cold as she looked toward the corner. There was no one there. She checked the room thoroughly, assuring Mrs. Harper that no one had been in her room. But the elderly woman insisted. "He was watching me, just standing there." Trying to calm the patient down, Emily made a note in her chart, chalking it up to a nightmare or confusion. But as she left the room and walked back into the hallway, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Hours passed, and the hospital remained quiet. Emily tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. She checked the security cameras at 4 a.m., hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. As she rewound the footage from earlier in the night, her breath caught in her throat. There on the screen in the hallway outside room 202 was a man. Tall, gaunt, dressed in dark clothing, he stood perfectly still, watching Emily as she passed by on her rounds. He had been there all along, standing just outside of her line of sight. When she had turned to look, he had simply stepped back into the shadows. But that wasn't the most chilling part. When Emily rewound the footage even further, she discovered that the man had been following her since she started her shift at midnight, always lurking just out of sight. Panicking, Emily called hospital security, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No man, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The cameras showed the figure, but there was no record of anyone entering or leaving the hospital at that time. Emily couldn't shake the image of the man watching her. For the rest of her shift, every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder, until finally, morning came and she could leave. The incident was never explained. Some believed the man was a lost patient or a vagrant who had slipped in unnoticed. Others whispered about the ghost stories surrounding the hospital's old wing, where countless patients had passed away over the decades. Emily never worked the night shift again. Jerry Matthews had worked the night shift at Lincoln's gas station for about 6 months when the strange incident occurred. Located just off Interstate 90 in a remote part of Idaho, the station was one of the few places open after midnight in that area. Most nights, Jerry would get a few truckers stopping in for fuel or snacks, but it was usually quiet, a perfect job for someone who enjoyed solitude. On the night of July 8, 2019, Jerry clocked in at 11 p.m. The weather had been dry all week, not a single drop of rain in sight, and the forecast showed nothing unusual. By 11:45 p.m., the station was empty, except for Jerry, who was behind the counter flipping through a magazine. Out of nowhere, the automatic door opened, making Jerry look up. A man entered, but something about him was off. He was soaking wet, his clothes clung to his skin, his hair dripping water onto the floor. The first thought that crossed Jerry's mind was, where did he come from? There hadn't been a car outside for nearly an hour, and the sky was clear, no sign of rain for miles. The man didn't speak. He walked straight to the refrigerated section, his soggy shoes squeaking on the tile. Jerry watched him, uneasy. "Hey man," Jerry called out, "you okay?" No response. The man pulled out a bottle of water, odd considering how drenched he already was, and came up to the counter. Jerry rang him up, trying to make conversation. "You get caught in a river or something?" The man stared blankly at Jerry, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he hadn't heard a word. He handed over a crumpled $5 bill, and Jerry quickly gave him his change, just wanting the interaction to be over. As the man turned to leave, Jerry couldn't help but notice something else. There were no footprints. The wet man had been walking around the gas station, yet not a single drop of water had marked the floor behind him. Jerry felt a chill crawl up his spine, but before he could say anything, the man walked out into the night. Jerry rushed to the door, watching as the man disappeared down the dark highway, on foot. No car, no bike, nothing. The whole encounter was strange, but it was what Jerry found after that shook him to his core. About an hour later, Jerry's shift was nearing its end, and he decided to check the security footage to review the strange man. He rewound the tape to the time the man had walked in. Only, there was nothing. The automatic door had opened, but no one appeared on the camera. It was as if Jerry had spoken to thin air. Panic set in. Jerry tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the light. But deep down, he knew what he had witnessed was real. He had seen the wet man, had spoken to him, taken his money, but the evidence was gone. Shaken, Jerry spent the rest of the night anxiously waiting for his shift to end. The next morning, he recounted the story to his manager, who dismissed it as stress or fatigue. But Jerry knew better. After doing some research, Jerry discovered a local legend about a man who had drowned in the nearby Snake River a decade earlier. He had been driving late at night when his car skidded off the road and plunged into the river. The man's body had been found days later, soaked and bloated from the water. Ever since then, there had been sporadic reports of a man, soaking wet, appearing at gas stations and diners along Interstate 90. But each time, just like with Jerry, the man would vanish without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of his visit. Jerry quit his night shift job 2 weeks later, unable to shake the eerie feeling that the man from the river might return. Sarah Lawson had been a nurse at the Pinewood Mental Health Facility for over 3 years. Nestled deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, the facility had a reputation for being one of the best in the state. However, the night shift was always filled with a peculiar tension. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, and the silence was often deafening. On the night of October 1st, 2018, Sarah started her shift at 11 p.m., a mix of excitement and unease swirling in her stomach. The clock struck 3:30 a.m. when the first call came in. The phone at the nurse's station rang, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Sarah picked it up, expecting to hear one of the residents asking for help. "Hello?" she said, her voice echoing in the empty room. There was silence on the other end, a chilling quiet that made Sarah's skin crawl. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice emerged. Soft, barely above a whisper. "Help me." Sarah's heart raced. "Who is this?" she asked, but there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing. Frustrated and unnerved, she hung up, trying to convince herself it was just a prank call. Moments later, the phone rang again. This time, she answered it more cautiously. "Hello? Help me. I can't breathe." The voice sounded desperate, filled with panic. "Where are you?" Sarah pressed, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this a patient trying to escape, or someone else entirely? "I'm in the dark. I can't see." The voice trembled, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. "Is this a joke?" She shouted into the receiver, her nerves fraying, but the line went dead again. With a feeling of dread hanging over her, Sarah decided to check on the patients. She made her rounds, but everyone appeared to be sleeping peacefully in their rooms. Each time she passed by room 204, the hair on her arms stood up. It was one of the facility's most troubled patients, a young man named Mark, who had a history of violent outbursts. He had been admitted after a series of psychotic breaks, and Sarah always kept a close eye on him during her shifts. As she neared his room, the phone rang once more. She rushed back to the nurse's station, answering it breathlessly. "Hello? I see you." The voice was now chillingly clear, sending a wave of panic through Sarah. "You should check on Mark." Sarah froze. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the caller hung up. Fearing the worst, she dashed to Mark's room. The door was ajar, and as she pushed it open, her heart sank. The room was empty. Panic surged as she ran to the common area, desperately searching for him. "Mark," she called, but her voice echoed through the empty halls. Then she heard it, a soft thud coming from the basement. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed the sound down the dimly lit staircase. The air grew colder as she descended, and the light flickered ominously above her head. At the bottom, she saw a shadowy figure standing by a closed door. "Mark!" she shouted, fear gripping her heart. "Is that you?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a familiar face, Mark. But he looked different, as if he were in a trance. His eyes were vacant, and his expression was unsettlingly calm. He stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness. "What are you doing down here?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. "I'm waiting for someone," he replied flatly. "Waiting for who?" Sarah pressed, her instincts screaming at her to get him back upstairs. "Help me," Mark echoed, but it sounded hollow, as if someone else had taken control of his voice. Suddenly, the phone rang again, shattering the tension. Sarah whipped around, her heart racing. She had left the phone on the counter in the common area, and it was now ringing frantically. "Stay here," she ordered Mark as she rushed back upstairs. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking. "Help me, in the dark." The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Who are you?" Sarah shouted into the receiver, desperate for answers. The voice whispered back, "I'm your next patient. Help me before it's too late." And then the line went dead. With the feeling of dread solidifying in her stomach, Sarah bolted back down the stairs. But when she reached the basement, Mark was gone. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the dark corners of the room. Then she heard it, the sound of laughter echoing from the shadows. "You should have listened," a distorted voice called out. Terrified, Sarah ran back upstairs, her heart racing. She reached the nurse's station, but the phone was silent now. She called for the police, her voice shaky as she explained the situation. When the officers arrived, they searched the facility thoroughly but found no trace of Mark or any evidence of a disturbance. Sarah, shaken and exhausted, could only sit back and wonder who or what had been on the other end of that phone call. Days turned into weeks, and Mark never returned to the facility. He vanished without a trace, and the haunting phone calls continued to plague Sarah every night, each one sounding more frantic and desperate than the last. The whispers echoed in her mind, leaving her questioning the reality of the world around her. She eventually quit her job, unable to cope with the fear and uncertainty. The Pinewood Mental Health Facility remains open, but Sarah Lawson's chilling experience serves as a reminder that some patients carry their darkness with them, long after they leave. Lisa Rodriguez had been a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital for over 2 years. Known for its excellent care and dedication, The hospital had a reputation for being a safe haven for those in need. But for Lisa, working the night shift often meant dealing with the eerie stillness of the halls, broken only by the occasional beeping of machines or the distant sound of an echoing footstep. On January 15th, 2021, Lisa started her shift at 11 p.m., feeling confident and prepared for a long night ahead. The first few hours were typical. She checked on her patients, administered medication, and updated charts. But as the clock ticked toward 12:30 a.m., she began to feel a strange unease settle in. During a routine check, Lisa decided to take a break at the nurse's station, which overlooked the main hallway. As she sat down to sip her coffee, she glanced at the security monitors, something she often did to keep an eye on the patients in the common areas. But something caught her eye, a flicker on the screen. Lisa leaned closer. There, in the corner of the hallway, was a shadowy figure standing motionless. It was unusually tall and seemed to be peering directly into the camera, almost as if it was watching her. "Who is that?" Lisa whispered to herself, puzzled. She quickly looked away from the monitor to the hallway, but it was empty. The feeling of dread wrapped around her like a cold blanket. Taking a deep breath, she returned her gaze to the screen, only to find the figure had disappeared. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, Lisa continued her shift. But the unease lingered. Over the next hour, she found herself checking the cameras more frequently, hoping to reassure herself that everything was fine. Each time, she felt a growing sense of foreboding. At 1:45 a.m., the figure appeared again. This time, it was closer, almost at the end of the hallway. Lisa's heart raced as she watched it. The figure was obscured by shadows, making it hard to discern any details. Panic set in as Lisa frantically switched to another camera angle, but the figure was no longer visible. She decided it was time to investigate. Taking a flashlight, she cautiously stepped out of the nurse's station and into the dimly lit hallway. Each step echoed ominously against the tile floor, and the oppressive silence made her skin crawl. Lisa made her way down the corridor, shining her flashlight in the direction where she had seen the figure. As she approached the end of the hall, she noticed that the door to room 314 was slightly ajar. It was a room that had been empty for months, awaiting renovation. "Hello?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. She pushed the door open, and the beam of her flashlight illuminated the space. It was dark and still, with dust motes swirling in the air. The room felt cold, and an unsettling chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Lisa jumped, spinning around to face the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as she pulled and pushed against it, but it was stuck fast. Then she heard it, a soft whisper coming from the darkness inside the room. "Help me." "Who's there?" Lisa shouted, her voice rising with fear. She fumbled for her phone to call for help, but just as she found it, the whispering stopped. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door, but her pleas echoed back at her, unanswered. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly flew open. Lisa stumbled forward, gasping for breath. The hallway was empty, but the oppressive silence now felt heavier. She bolted back to the nurse's station, shaking uncontrollably. Once there, she checked the cameras again, desperate for any sign of what had happened. But the feed was static. Nothing but a blank screen. Lisa felt as if she were losing her grip on reality. The bizarre events of the night were too much to comprehend. By 3 a.m., Lisa was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept her alert. The phone rang, breaking the tense atmosphere. Lisa picked it up, but the line was silent. Then she heard the whisper again. "Help me, room 314. Her blood ran cold. This time, she knew it wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Something dark lingered in the hospital, and she was being drawn deeper into its mystery. Determined to uncover the truth, Lisa gathered her courage and returned to room 314. As she approached, the door creaked open on its own. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and she stepped inside. The room was the same as before, but now a faint glow emitted from the corner. Lisa shone her flashlight in that direction and gasped. There, lying on the floor, was a hospital gown, old, tattered, and stained. It was impossible, but somehow it felt familiar. The whisper returned, more insistent now. "Help me." Lisa knelt down, examining the gown. As she reached for it, the temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a breath of icy air wash over her. The whisper turned into a wail, echoing in her ears. "Help me! I can't leave!" In that moment, Lisa understood. The figure she had seen was a lost soul, trapped in the hospital, begging for release. She felt a surge of empathy, mixed with fear. "I'll help you," she vowed, her voice shaking. Suddenly, the room shook, as if a strong wind had blown through. The whispers turned into screams, the air crackling with energy. Lisa stumbled back, fear consuming her, as she dashed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For the rest of her shift, Lisa could barely focus. She relayed her experiences to her supervisor, but he dismissed her concerns as mere fatigue from the long hours. Despite his skepticism, Lisa knew what she had encountered was real. After that night, the incidents continued. Patients reported seeing shadows in their rooms, and nurses experienced strange occurrences late at night. Lisa eventually left her job, unable to bear the weight of the haunting anymore. To this day, St. Mary's Hospital has gained notoriety among staff and patients alike for being haunted. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the whispers of the lost soul calling out for help in the dark corridors. Tom Miller had been a caregiver at Silver Oaks Nursing Home for nearly 5 years. He loved his job, caring for the elderly and listening to their stories. Each resident had a unique tale to share, filled with memories of love, loss, and laughter. But working the night shift could often feel lonely, especially in a place where shadows seemed to stretch and twist under the dim lights. On the night of February 2nd, 2019, Tom began his shift at 10 p.m. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with Tom performing his usual duties, checking on residents, dispensing medications, and ensuring everyone was comfortable. As the clock approached 2 a.m., the nursing home fell into a deep silence, broken only by the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the building settling. While doing his rounds, Tom stopped outside room 203, where Mrs. Johnson, a sweet elderly lady, had been residing for several months. He noticed the door was slightly ajar and heard her mumbling. Concerned, he knocked gently. "Mrs. Johnson? Are you all right?" The mumbling stopped and silence filled the air. Frowning, Tom pushed the door open. "Mrs. Johnson?" To his surprise, the room was empty. The bed was made and the curtains were drawn. Puzzled, he checked the bathroom, but she wasn't there either. Tom quickly glanced at the logbook on the desk, which noted that Mrs. Stad Johnson had been resting since 10:30 p.m. Confused, he jotted down a note about her absence before continuing his rounds. As Tom moved toward the common area, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The nursing home had a history. It was built in the late 1960s and had seen its share of residents pass away within its walls. Rumors circulated among the staff about ghostly apparitions and strange noises at night. Most dismissed these tales as folklore, but Tom had experienced a few odd occurrences himself over the years. That night, as he made his way back to the nurse's station, he heard a soft whisper echoing through the hall. He paused, straining to hear. "Help me, please." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the stillness. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice shaky, but there was no answer. Thinking it might be one of the residents, he followed the sound toward the end of the hall. The whispers grew louder, guiding him to room 205. He opened the door and found it empty as well. The bed was neatly made, and the resident, Mr. Thompson, was not there. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, a sense of dread creeping over him. Just as he was about to step back into the hallway, he heard the whisper again, now sounding desperate. "Tom, help me." His heart raced as he instinctively turned to the wall beside him. "Who's there?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to a wall. The response was immediate. 3 soft knocks echoed back. Tom's stomach dropped. He took a step back, nearly colliding with the bedside table. "Is anyone in there?" he called, but silence followed. He quickly left the room and returned to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the fear that threatened to consume him. Sitting down, Tom wrote down the names of the missing residents in the logbook. Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Thompson were just the beginning. By the end of his shift, he realized several other residents were unaccounted for, including Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Rodriguez, both of whom he had seen earlier in the evening. At 3:30 a.m., Tom was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion when he heard the whispering again. Clearer this time, "Tom, help us." He bolted upright, gripping the edge of the desk. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It felt urgent, pleading. Unable to ignore it, Tom took a deep breath and headed back down the hall. The sound led him to room 201, a resident who had passed away just a month earlier. He hesitated, uncertainty gnawing at him, but the voices were insistent. Pushing open the door, Tom was met with darkness. The curtains were drawn tight, and the shadows danced eerily across the walls. He flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "This is ridiculous," he murmured, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a crescendo. "Help us. We can't leave." The sound filled the room, drowning out his thoughts. Panicking, Tom stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. Just then, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of movement near the closet. He turned his flashlight toward it, and the beam revealed a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear. "Please help us," she cried, her voice a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm Margaret. I died here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need your help to move on. They're keeping us here." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of spirits lingering in places where they had suffered, but this was his first encounter. "How can I help you?" he stammered, trying to steady his breathing. "Break the cycle," she replied, her voice growing fainter. "Free us from this place." Before he could respond, the light flickered back on, illuminating the room. But Margaret had vanished, leaving Tom alone in the suffocating silence. Desperate for answers, Tom rushed back to the nurse's station and called the on-duty supervisor. He explained everything: the whispers, the missing residents, and the woman in the room. The supervisor listened, but was dismissive, attributing it to Tom's fatigue. "Just finish your shift, and we'll look into it tomorrow," he said, clearly unconvinced. Feeling isolated, Tom decided to investigate further. He rummaged through old files, searching for information about the nursing home's history. What he found chilled him to the bone. Silver Oaks had been built on the grounds of a former asylum that had been shut down for neglect and abuse. Many patients had died in the facility, their suffering forgotten as the nursing home took its place. Each name Tom read felt like a ghostly echo of the lives lost. Fueled by a mix of fear and determination, Tom returned to the hallways. He decided to confront the whispers. "If you need help, I'm here," he shouted, hoping to draw out the spirits. The building was silent, but then he heard it. The soft rustle of fabric, the faintest sound of shuffling footsteps. "Help us," the voices called again, this time echoing from room 207. Tom's heart raced as he approached the door, pushing it open with trembling hands. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy. As he stepped inside, he saw the figures, several elderly residents, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. "What happened to you?" he gasped, stepping back in shock. "We're trapped," one woman whispered, her voice breaking. "They don't remember us. We can't move on." In that moment, Tom understood. These were the souls of the residents who had passed away, trapped in a limbo, bound to the nursing home that had failed them. "What do I need to do?" he asked, feeling a sense of urgency wash over him. "Tell our stories," they all murmured in unison. "Remember us." Realizing that he needed to acknowledge their pain, Tom agreed. "I promise," he said firmly. "I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here." With that vow, the air in the room shifted, and he felt a wave of warmth wash over him. The residents' faces began to fade, their expressions softening as peace settled over them. As dawn broke, the first light of morning spilled through the windows. Tom felt a sense of relief mixed with sorrow. The whispers had ceased, and the oppressive heaviness lifted from the nursing home. He completed his shift, determined to share the stories of the residents who had been forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Tom began documenting the history of Silver Oaks Nursing Home, interviewing staff and families to ensure the memories of those who had passed lived on. He shared their stories with anyone who would listen, bringing light to the shadows of the past. As for the nursing home, it has since been transformed into a place of remembrance. Tom's efforts led to a community memorial honoring the residents who had lost their lives there. And while the whispers no longer haunt the halls, Tom knows that their spirits are finally at peace. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the shadows of the night. Each story reveals the haunting truth of what can linger in the dark when no one is watching. Remember, the night shift isn't just about clocking hours. It's a window into the unknown, where every creak and whisper could tell a story of its own. If you've experienced something eerie during your own night shifts, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Summer of 2002, when the Wilkins family moved into their dream home in Sussex, England. Tom and Sarah Wilkins had saved for years to buy a secluded countryside house, a place they imagined raising their two young children, Emily and Jacob. The house was perfect, nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by lush fields and a picturesque river nearby. It seemed like an ideal spot to escape the busy city life. But their excitement about this new chapter of their lives would soon fade, replaced by dread and terror. What they didn't know when they moved in was that the very ground beneath them was a place where the dead did not rest peacefully. The house, which had been built just a few decades prior, was relatively new, but the land it stood on had a far older and darker history. A history that had been buried and forgotten for centuries. Long ago, the area had been home to a medieval burial ground. Hundreds of bodies, laid to rest in shallow graves, had once filled the land. Over time, the cemetery was abandoned, and nature reclaimed the land. The gravestones crumbled, the graves themselves became forgotten, and eventually, the land was developed for new homes. The burial ground had been paved over, the dead left undisturbed for centuries, until the Wilkins family arrived. The first few weeks in the new house were peaceful. The kids played in the sprawling yard, the family enjoyed quiet evenings on the porch, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. But one afternoon, Tom was mowing the lawn when he hit something hard beneath the grass. He stopped the mower and got down on his hands and knees, brushing away the dirt to reveal a small, weathered stone. It was cracked and covered in moss, but as he wiped it clean, he saw that it wasn't just any stone, it was a gravestone. The words were faded, nearly impossible to read, but there was no mistaking what it was. Tom called Sarah over, and the two of them stood staring at the stone in disbelief. "Maybe it's just an old marker or something," Sarah said, trying to brush it off. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around the house. At night, they would hear faint whispers coming from beneath the floorboards, as if someone or something was speaking from below. Emily, their 5-year-old daughter, began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming that there was someone standing in her room, watching her. At first, Tom and Sarah thought it was just her imagination, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. The family dog, Max, started acting strange too. He would stand in the middle of the living room, barking furiously at something unseen. He'd refuse to enter certain rooms, growling low in his throat whenever he got near the basement door. The unease in the house grew with each passing day, but it was what happened next that truly terrified them. One night, just a few weeks after they discovered the gravestone in the yard, Tom was woken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He sat up in bed, listening closely. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other. Thinking it was one of the kids, Tom got up to check. He walked into Emily's room first, but she was sound asleep, her small body curled up under the blankets. He checked on Jacob next, but he too was fast asleep. The footsteps continued, echoing through the quiet house. Tom's heart began to race as he realized they weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from below. The next morning, Tom couldn't shake the eerie feeling from the night before. He decided to do some research into the property's history, and what he found chilled him to the bone. The land their house sat on had once been the site of a medieval cemetery. Hundreds of people had been buried there over the centuries, many of them in unmarked graves. The graves had been forgotten as the area was developed, but it seemed that the spirits of the dead had not moved on. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Tom and Sarah decided to dig in the backyard where they had found the gravestone. What they uncovered was shocking. Just a few feet beneath the surface were dozens of old, weathered gravestones, some of them cracked and broken, others still intact but covered in dirt and moss. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Their house had been built on top of a burial ground. After that, the strange occurrences in the house only intensified. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects would move without explanation, and the whispers at night grew louder and more insistent. One evening, as Sarah was doing the laundry in the basement, she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Another night, Tom saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed, a shadowy form that vanished the moment he turned on the light. But the worst was yet to come. One stormy night, the family was gathered in the living room, trying to ignore the strange noises that seemed to come from the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. As Tom fumbled for a flashlight, he heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around them. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is our home." Terrified, the family huddled together in the dark, waiting for the storm to pass. When the lights finally came back on, they packed their bags and left the house that very night. They never returned. The house in Sussex still stands, abandoned and empty. Locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of the restless spirits who once called the burial ground their final resting place. The Wilkins family may have moved on, but the dead are still there, waiting for the day when their home is truly at peace. In the small town of Jackson, Mississippi, there's a place that most locals won't dare talk about: Old Wilkerson Cemetery. Hidden away on the outskirts of town, the cemetery was founded in the late 1800s as a burial ground for the town's early settlers. Over the years, it became the final resting place for many of Jackson's citizens, but it also gained a sinister reputation for something far darker. Strange occurrences have been reported at the cemetery for decades: flickering lights, disembodied voices, and figures seen wandering among the graves late at night. But the most terrifying story comes from 1994, when a group of teenagers from the local high school decided to test the legend for themselves. What they experienced that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The group of 5, Jenny, Marcus, Ben, Lisa, and Derek, had heard the stories about Old Wilkerson Cemetery all their lives. Some said the cemetery was haunted by the ghost of a Civil War soldier who had been buried there in an unmarked grave. Others claimed the spirits of the dead roamed the grounds at night, searching for anyone foolish enough to trespass. But like many teenagers, they were skeptical of ghost stories. They wanted to see for themselves if there was any truth to the legends. So, one Friday night in early October, they decided to go on a midnight adventure to the cemetery. It was the perfect time of year for a haunting. The leaves were starting to turn, the air had a chill to it, and a heavy fog had rolled in that evening, giving the entire town an eerie atmosphere. The group met up at Marcus's house around 11 p.m., packed flashlights, snacks, and a couple of blankets, and made their way to the cemetery. It was about a 20-minute drive from the center of town, down a winding dirt road surrounded by dense woods. By the time they reached the entrance, the fog was so thick they could barely see the old rusted gate that marked the cemetery's boundary. "Are we really doing this?" Lisa asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice as they pulled up to the gate. "This place is creepy as hell." "Come on, Lisa," Ben teased. "You're not scared of a couple of old graves, are you?" Lisa rolled her eyes, but she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Something about the cemetery didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too still. But the others were already climbing out of the car, and she didn't want to be the only one chickening out. So she followed them through the gate and into the cemetery. The graves stretched out before them, row after row of old, crumbling headstones. Some of the markers were so weathered that the names had worn away completely, while others were cracked and leaning, as if the earth beneath them had shifted. A few headstones were still legible, their inscriptions revealing names and dates that went back more than 100 years. The group wandered through the cemetery, their flashlights cutting through the fog as they whispered nervously to each other. There was something unnerving about being in a place meant for the dead, especially in the dead of night. After a while, they found a clearing near the back of the cemetery where a large, gnarled oak tree stood, its branches twisted and curled overhead, casting long shadows on the ground. It was here that they decided to sit down and tell ghost stories. They spread out the blankets and sat in a circle, laughing and joking as they tried to outscare each other with their tales. But as the night wore on, the mood began to shift. The laughter died down, and an uneasy silence fell over the group. It was as if the air had grown heavier and colder. Jenny was the first to notice it. She was sitting closest to the tree when she felt something brush against her arm. She looked down, expecting to see a branch or a leaf, but there was nothing there, just the cold night air. "Did you guys feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Marcus replied, shining his flashlight around. "I don't know. It felt like someone touched me," Jenny said, rubbing her arm. "Maybe it was just the wind," Derek suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. Jenny shook her head. "No, it wasn't the wind. It felt like a hand." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. They all tried to brush it off, telling themselves it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But as the night dragged on, the strange occurrences began to pile up. Marcus's flashlight flickered and died, even though he had just put new batteries in it. Lisa swore she saw a shadow move out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. And then there was the whispering. It started off faint, barely audible, like a soft breeze rustling through the trees. But soon it grew louder, more insistent. It was a voice, low and raspy, like someone speaking just out of earshot. The group froze, their eyes darting around the cemetery, but they couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" Ben called out, his voice shaking. But there was no answer, just more whispering. "Maybe we should go," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "This place is giving me the creeps." But before anyone could move, the ground beneath them began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a distant rumble of thunder, but then it grew stronger. The earth shook violently, and the group scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus shouted, grabbing onto the tree for support. Suddenly, the ground in front of them split open, and a gaping hole appeared where a grave had once been. Dirt and rocks tumbled into the pit as the group watched in horror. And then, something rose up from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark, shapeless form that seemed to writhe and twist in the air. But as it climbed out of the grave, it began to take on a more human shape. A figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and skeletal hands, emerged from the pit. Its clothes were tattered and rotting, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. The group stood frozen in terror as the figure took a step toward them, its eyes locked on Jenny. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out with one skeletal hand, its fingers brushing against her arm. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The ground stopped shaking and the air grew still once more. The group stood in stunned silence, their hearts racing, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "We need to get out of here," Derek said, his voice barely a whisper. No one argued. They grabbed their things and ran back to the car as fast as they could, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. By the time they reached the safety of the car, they were all shaking with fear. They didn't speak a word on the drive back to town. The next day, they went to the local library to research the history of the cemetery. What they found only confirmed their worst fears. The cemetery had been the site of numerous hauntings over the years, and the figure they had seen matched the description of a man who had been buried there in the early 1900s. He had been a notorious murderer, hanged for his crimes and buried in an unmarked grave. Legend had it that his spirit had never found peace, and that he roamed the cemetery at night, searching for new victims. The group never returned to Old Wilkerson Cemetery, and they never spoke of what happened that night. But the memory of that skeletal figure rising from the grave would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Burial grounds are often associated with peace, a final resting place where the dead can sleep undisturbed. But in the small town of Pine Hollow, North Carolina, there's one burial ground that brings anything but peace, the infamous Whispering Pines Burial Ground. Nestled deep within a sprawling pine forest, this place had been abandoned for nearly a century, its gravestones overgrown with moss and ivy. But what many didn't know was that this burial ground held a dark secret, a curse that has haunted the town for generations. In 1921, the town of Pine Hollow was a bustling lumber town, home to hardworking families who lived simple lives. The Whispering Pines Burial Ground, established in 1870, was meant to serve as the final resting place for the town's citizens. It was quiet and serene, surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the wind, their leaves creating a soft whispering sound that gave the cemetery its name. But things took a terrifying turn in the summer of 1922. A strange illness swept through Pine Hollow, taking the lives of several families. The source of the illness was never identified, and whispers of a curse began to spread among the townspeople. It was said that the curse was tied to the burial ground, where many of the victims had been laid to rest. One of the most notable victims was a young woman named Emily Cartwright. She was just 24 years old when she fell ill, and within days, she was dead. Her death shook the town, as she had been engaged to a local farmer, William Harding, and their wedding was only weeks away. In his grief, William spent nearly every day at Whispering Pines, sitting by her grave, talking to her as if she could still hear him. But William's sorrow soon turned to madness when, late one evening, he swore he heard Emily's voice calling out to him from beneath the ground. Desperate and convinced that she was alive, William returned the next night with a shovel. Under the cover of darkness, he began digging up her grave, convinced that he could save her. But as he dug deeper, the earth seemed to resist him, growing heavier with each shovelful of dirt. His arms ached, his heart raced, but he refused to stop. And then, just as he reached the coffin, he heard it again, the soft, mournful voice of Emily calling his name. "William?" He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was faint but unmistakable. His hands trembled as he opened the coffin, expecting to see Emily lying there, her eyes open, waiting for him. But what he found was far more horrifying. Emily's body lay exactly as it had been when she was buried, her skin pale and cold, her eyes closed, but her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and her hands were curled into claws, as if she had been trying to claw her way out of the coffin. William recoiled in horror, stumbling backward into the grave. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, filling his mind with madness. The next morning, William was found dead beside Emily's grave, his hands covered in dirt, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The townspeople were horrified by the discovery, and rumors of a curse on Whispering Pines burial ground spread like wildfire. For years, no one dared visit the cemetery after dark. The whispering that gave the cemetery its name took on a more sinister meaning. Locals claimed that the wind carried the voices of the dead, calling out to those foolish enough to enter the burial ground. Some said that the spirits of the cursed burial ground sought new souls to join them, while others believed that the land itself was evil, tainted by something ancient and malevolent. The curse remained a part of Pine Hollow's folklore, but for decades, no one had any real proof of the burial ground's dark powers. That was until 1997, when a group of paranormal investigators decided to explore the infamous cemetery in hopes of capturing evidence of the supernatural. Led by Dr. Samantha Greer, a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, the team included 2 students, Jake Harris and Amanda Sullivan, and a local historian named Tom Callahan. Dr. Greer had always been fascinated by the legends surrounding Whispering Pines, and when she received a grant to study paranormal phenomena, she knew exactly where she wanted to start. She had heard countless stories about the cemetery and its supposed curse, but she wanted to see for herself if there was any truth to the tales. On a foggy autumn evening, the group made their way to Whispering Pines burial ground. The cemetery was even more overgrown than they had expected. The old iron gate had rusted away, and the graves were almost entirely hidden beneath thick underbrush. As they set up their equipment, cameras, voice recorders, and electromagnetic sensors, the wind began to pick up, causing the trees to sway and groan. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and an eerie silence hung over the burial ground. "I've read about this place my whole life," Tom Callahan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the curse, about how the dead would come back if you spoke their names aloud." "Well, let's hope that's just a story," Jake replied with a nervous laugh. But Dr. Greer was serious. "We're here to find out the truth," she said, her voice firm. "Let's not get spooked by old legends." As the night wore on, the group began to notice strange occurrences. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Cameras would turn off on their own, batteries would drain inexplicably, and their voice recorders would pick up faint, whispering sounds that couldn't be explained. Around midnight, the group gathered near the oldest part of the cemetery, where the graves dated back to the late 1800s. Greer was scanning the area with an EMF detector when Amanda suddenly gasped, pointing toward a large, weathered gravestone. "Did you see that?" Amanda's voice shook. There was someone standing there, right by that grave. Jake shined his flashlight in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees and the old grave markers. "You're just seeing things," Jake said, trying to reassure her, though his voice betrayed his own fear. But Amanda was adamant. "No, I saw something. I'm not imagining it." The group continued to investigate, but the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The wind began to howl through the trees, and the whispering seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was as if the very ground beneath them was alive, watching them, waiting for them to leave, or perhaps for something far worse. And then it happened. As they passed by a large, crumbling mausoleum near the edge of the cemetery, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. The mausoleum door, which had been sealed shut for decades, suddenly burst open with a loud crash, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Dr. Greer screamed as a figure emerged from the darkness of the mausoleum. A figure dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, its face gaunt and skeletal. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and its mouth opened wide as if it were about to speak. But instead of words, a low, guttural moan escaped its lips, echoing through the cemetery. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Amanda's arm and pulling her away from the mausoleum. The group fled through the overgrown graveyard, the whispers growing louder and louder with each step. It felt as though the very air around them was pressing in, suffocating them, slowing them down. But they didn't stop. They ran through the rusted gate and didn't look back until they reached the safety of their car. Breathless and shaking, they piled into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. As they drove away, the cemetery disappeared into the fog behind them, but the memory of what they had seen would stay with them forever. The footage they captured that night was never released to the public. Dr. Greer claimed that it was too disturbing, too dangerous to be shown. But rumors of what happened at Whispering Pines spread quickly through the town of Pine Hollow. Some say that the curse of the burial ground is more powerful than ever, that the spirits are growing restless. Others claim that the figures seen in the cemetery are not spirits at all, but something far older, something evil that has been lying in wait for centuries. And to this day, no one dares to visit Whispering Pines burial ground after dark. And there you have it. 3 stories of burial grounds that should have remained undisturbed. But as we've learned tonight, curiosity often gets the better of people, and some secrets buried in the earth refuse to stay hidden. Whether it's the cursed spirits seeking revenge, the unexplained occurrences that defy logic, or the horrifying encounters that remind us that death doesn't always mean the end. It's clear that some places carry more than just history. The next time you drive past an old graveyard or hear stories of sacred land, remember this: not all graves are silent, and sometimes disturbing the dead means they come looking for you. What would you do if you felt those eyes watching you from the shadows? If you heard that whisper in the dead of night, let me know in the comments below. On November 12, 2019, at exactly 9:15 a.m., Westbrook High in St. Charles, Missouri, entered a full-scale lockdown. Mrs. Andrews, the history teacher for room 201, was reviewing the day's assignments when the sudden blare of the PA system startled the students. Principal Graves' voice was calm but carried a sense of urgency. "Attention all students and staff. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Instantly, Mrs. Andrews bolted the classroom door, her hands trembling. The students' expressions shifted from confusion to fear, especially when the door rattled as she yanked the chain across the top. The classroom lights were switched off, and she motioned for the students to gather under the desks. In the far corner, Samantha Dean, Sam to her friends, huddled beneath her desk. Sam, a sophomore, had always felt safe at Westbrook High. It was a school where the biggest drama came from who was dating who, or which teacher handed out the most homework. But now her heart raced as her mind swirled with dread, trying to imagine what was happening in the halls just outside the door. The first hour. As the minutes passed, the tension in the room grew thicker. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, followed by voices, official ones at first. Teachers communicate through their phones, hesitant, and police officers give orders. But then came the sound no one had prepared for, a loud crash, as if something or someone had slammed into a locker just down the hall. The students froze, barely breathing. From under her desk, Sam could hear Mrs. Andrews whispering into her phone, speaking too quietly for the students to make out. But her body language, rigid and tense, spoke volumes. Sam's mind raced back to the stories she'd heard on the news about school shootings, the drills they'd practiced over and over again. Except this time, it wasn't a drill. The second hour, time seemed to slow. The cold air from outside seeped into the cracks, making it hard to tell if the shivering was from fear or the temperature. Sam glanced at her phone, which was still on silent. It was 10:42 a.m. A text from her mom flashed across the screen. "Are you safe? What's happening?" She wanted to reply, but didn't dare make a sound. In the darkness, the classroom felt claustrophobic, like the walls were slowly closing in. From the hallway, faint whispers could be heard, followed by a soft knock on the door. Mrs. Andrews motioned for the students to stay quiet, her hand visibly trembling. The knock came again, this time louder. And then, silence. After what felt like an eternity, the distant sound of sirens cut through the quiet. Were they close, or were they just starting to arrive? No one knew for sure. Hour 3. By noon, the students were physically exhausted from being crouched under the desks for so long. Some of them had started to silently cry, but Sam remained focused on listening to every noise. Every creak of the floorboards, every footstep outside the door. Around 12:30 p.m., the PA system crackled to life again. "Teachers, this is Officer Denton. Please remain in your classrooms until further notice." No one had seen the officer enter, and no one could confirm if this was a sign of safety or another looming threat. Outside the classroom, however, something was brewing. Sam's friend, Eric, who had been texting her from a different classroom earlier, stopped replying around 11 a.m. His last message had read, "I think someone is in the hall." After that, silence. Sam's stomach twisted in knots, wondering if he was okay. The final hour. It wasn't until 2 p.m. that the nightmare showed signs of ending. A loudspeaker announcement declared, "The situation is now under control. Please wait for officers to escort you from the building." Relief washed over the room, but Sam felt it wasn't over yet. Mrs. Andrews instructed everyone to remain quiet and still. One by one, officers led students and teachers from the building. As they passed through the once familiar halls, Sam noticed something strange. On the far wall near the science lab, the lockers had been pried open, their contents scattered across the floor. There were smears, dark, almost like ink, leading toward the exit. Aftermath. Days later, details of the lockdown slowly emerged. A man, armed and mentally unstable, had breached the school's security. He'd been found lurking in the hallways after triggering alarms at the far entrance. The lockdown was initiated the moment the school realized someone had broken in. But for nearly 6 hours, no one knew just how close he'd gotten to the classrooms. Sam never saw the man, but the sight of the opened lockers and the eerie silence of the day stayed with her. She never found out what happened to Eric during those hours, as he transferred schools shortly after, too shaken by the event to return. To this day, every time Sam hears the sound of lockers slamming shut, she's brought back to that long, cold day in November when time stood still inside the walls of Westbrook High. On December 20th, 2018, at approximately 1:45 p.m., the halls of Maplewood Middle School in Asheville, North Carolina, were bustling with students eagerly preparing for the upcoming winter holidays. The festive spirit was alive, with students wearing ugly Christmas sweaters and exchanging homemade treats. Among them was 13-year-old Mia Collins, who couldn't wait to share her secret gingerbread recipe with her friends during the afternoon party planned in the cafeteria. As the final bell rang at 2 p.m., the joyful chatter erupted into the hallways. Students rushed to grab their backpacks and head to the cafeteria for the last celebration of the year. But just as Mia and her friends were about to step outside, an urgent voice blared over the intercom, slicing through the merriment like a knife. Attention all students and staff, we are entering a lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The first hour. Mia's heart dropped as her teacher, Mr. Thompson, immediately sprang into action, locking the classroom door and instructing everyone to move away from the windows. Panic rippled through the classroom, and the once cheerful atmosphere turned dark as fear took hold. Everyone, stay quiet, Mr. Thompson urged, his voice steady but urgent. We need to stay calm and wait for further instructions. Mia felt the weight of fear pressing down on her chest as she sat on the floor with her friends, trying to make sense of the situation. What was happening outside? Was it a false alarm, or was there a real threat lurking just beyond the classroom door? Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The usually friendly atmosphere of the classroom transformed into a tense silence. The only sound was the ticking clock, counting down the moments of uncertainty. The second hour, around 3 p.m., the school's intercom crackled to life again. All classrooms, please remain in lockdown. Officers are on the scene investigating a situation near the school. Please remain calm and quiet. The students exchanged terrified glances, their eyes wide with fear. Mia's thoughts raced as she considered the possibility of a shooter being nearby. She thought of her younger brother, who was at a nearby elementary school. Would he be safe? After another half hour of silence, the distinct sound of police sirens echoed through the halls. Mia's anxiety peaked. She turned to her friend Jenna, who was sitting next to her. What do you think is happening? She whispered. I don't know, Jenna replied, her voice shaking. I just hope we're okay. The final hour. As time stretched on, the waiting felt endless. At around 4 p.m., the intercom crackled again. Students and staff, we will begin evacuating classrooms. Please stay seated until an officer arrives at your door. Mia's heart raced at the thought of finally leaving the classroom, but dread crept in. What if the threat was still out there? The thought made her stomach twist as she sat in the corner, gripping her backpack tightly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Ramirez appeared at the door, his expression serious but reassuring. Okay, we're going to get you out safely. Just follow my lead. As they filed out of the classroom, the atmosphere felt heavy with tension. Mia looked around at the faces of her classmates, fear and confusion reflected in their eyes. The hallways were eerily quiet, devoid of the festive sounds that had filled them just hours before. Aftermath. Once outside, the students were gathered on the football field as officers conducted a thorough sweep of the building. The mood was somber as they awaited news. It wasn't until around 5:30 p.m. that the principal, Mrs. Parker, approached the students to address them. Everyone, I want to thank you for your bravery and cooperation today, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Earlier this afternoon, we received reports of a man with a firearm spotted near the school. Thanks to the quick response of the police, the situation has been resolved. The individual was apprehended without incident, and everyone is safe now. Mia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Relief washed over her, but the reality of what had just occurred began to settle in. The fear, the uncertainty, and the silence of that afternoon would stay with her forever. That night, as Mia lay in bed, the sounds of laughter from her earlier celebration echoed in her mind. The joy had been replaced by an eerie stillness that she couldn't shake. The winter holiday party was meant to be a celebration, but it would forever be marred by the memories of fear and uncertainty. Mia returned to school after the break, but the air felt different. Conversations about the incident filled the halls, and her peers often glanced nervously at the exits. The atmosphere of the school had shifted. Innocence was lost in an instant. The sound of silence lingered, a reminder of how quickly life can change. On February 14, 2017, at 1 p.m., Lincoln High School in Parkland, Florida, was in the midst of a busy school day. Students were bustling to and from their classes, laughing and joking with friends. Among them was 17-year-old Alex Johnson, who was just wrapping up his calculus class. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, the students began to gather their belongings, eager to head to lunch. Suddenly, the sound of the fire alarm pierced through the air, confusing the students. Was it just another drill? But the frantic tone of the alarm felt different. "Is this a drill?" one student asked, glancing at Alex. "I don't think so," Alex replied, his heart racing. "We should head outside." As they filed out of the classroom, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to concern. The fire alarm continued blaring and students rushed down the hall toward the nearest exits. But just as they reached the doors, the school's PA system crackled to life, the principal's voice echoing through the corridors. "Attention students and staff, we are entering lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Please move to the nearest classroom and lock the doors." The first hour, chaos erupted as students scrambled to find safety. Alex quickly ducked into the nearest classroom with a group of friends, their hearts pounding in their chests. The teacher, Mrs. Martinez, locked the door and turned off the lights. "What's happening?" someone whispered, fear palpable in the room. "I don't know," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice shaking. "We need to stay quiet and wait for more information." Alex felt a growing sense of dread as they huddled together in the dark. Outside, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, and the distant chatter of students became muffled cries. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour, and the sounds of sirens began to fill the air, creating a symphony of fear. With every passing second, Alex's anxiety mounted. What was happening outside? Were they safe? The second hour, around 2:30 p.m., the intercom crackled again, this time filled with panic. "We are experiencing a code red. Stay hidden. Hidden. Stay." The fear was suffocating. The reality of a potential shooter lurking within the school set in, and Alex felt his heart racing as he glanced at his friends. The quiet room was filled with muffled sobs and whispered prayers. "Do you think it's really happening?" one of his friends asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Alex replied, trying to sound brave, but inside he felt like he might crumble. The final hour. As time dragged on, the group remained in silence, straining to listen for any updates. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time they were heavier, more deliberate. The classroom door rattled slightly and panic spread through the room. Mrs. Martinez held her finger to her lips, urging everyone to stay silent. The tension was unbearable, and Alex could feel the weight of fear pressing down on him. Around 3:15 p.m., the door finally swung open, and the silhouette of a police officer filled the doorway. "Is everyone here?" he asked, scanning the room. "Yes," Mrs. Martinez exclaimed, relief washing over her. "We're all safe." "Stay here until we give the all clear," the officer instructed before disappearing down the hallway. Aftermath. It wasn't until nearly 5 p.m. that the students were finally escorted out of the building. The sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the school grounds as they walked out, still in shock. As we reached the end of our journey through these chilling tales of school lockdowns, we hope you felt the tension, the fear, and ultimately the resilience that emerged from such harrowing experiences. Mia, Alex, and their classmates not only faced unimaginable terror, but also transformed their fear into strength, reminding us all that in the darkest times, hope and unity can shine the brightest. Their stories are a testament to the power of community and the importance of mental health awareness. We may never forget the horrors that unfolded, but together we can work towards creating safer, more supportive environments for everyone. If you found these true stories both haunting and inspiring, you never know when the next unsettling story might find its way to your screen. Stay safe out there, because sometimes the scariest things come from within our own homes. Until next time, keep your lights on and your phones close.